This is why I have so many problems with the DSM, because this is not mentioned once. And as you can see from these responses, this is a devastating symptom for so many people with ADHD. Like, I think in Dodson's talk, he says that it's like the most debilitating symptom according to 30% of ADHDers. The number one, not the time management, not the other stuff. You can figure out ways around it. But the rejection sensitivity, it just feels like there is no hope and no way.
Welcome to It's Just ADHD. We're two curious ADHD coaches, and we're going deep on the how, the why, and the strategies to get through the difficult moments and how to make the best of life with ADHD. I'm John, and I've got an adult diagnosis of ADHD.
And I'm Tara, and I have a late in life ADHD diagnosis and an even later autism diagnosis. We're going to be diving headfirst into the messy and often complicated research around ADHD and autism. And we're bringing you along for the journey as we break it all down and make sense of everything.
Because sometimes it's just life.
And sometimes it's just ADHD. So before we begin, I just want to remind you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. It is not intended to replace professional medical care. We are not doctors. We don't claim to be. We are just a couple of nerds who find this information and this research really fascinating, and we want to discuss it, but please keep your medical decisions between you and your doctor and keep us out of it. All right, let's begin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to It's Just ADHD, where we explore life through the lens of ADHD and autism. I'm John.
And I'm Tara.
And today we're talking through something that a lot of people with ADHD and autism experience, but don't always have a name for. If you haven't heard of it, it's rejection sensitive dysphoria, or RSD.
Yeah, and I think this one, it's hard to say whether it happens as much in the autistic community. Some people would say yes. Other people don't necessarily talk about it as much, but this is certainly a very hallmark ADHD trait, to the extent that some of the clinicians who work with ADHDers all the time, like Dr. William Dodson, he's seen thousands and thousands of ADHD patients. He thinks that it shows up for 100% of ADHDers. And the tragedy is that this isn't even a part of the DSM, which is something that he gets very angry about. And he has a whole long talk about this that we have linked in the links section below. So definitely be sure to check that out if you want to listen to another hour-long talk after our very, very long talk on RSD.
Yeah, this is it's different from general emotional dysregulation. It's specific, it's instant. Sometimes it's a debilitating reaction because it can shut down your whole system in really like unexpected, kind of surprising ways. So today we're going to break that down. What is it, the science behind it, how it impacts us, and some things that can actually help.
Well, and that's one of the interesting points too, is that the folks that work with ADHDers have different perspectives. So, for example, Russell Barkley, who also is one of the ADHD titans, he does not believe that it should be a distinct condition. He thinks that it is part of emotional dysregulation.
So, is there such a thing as RSD? And does it need to be added into the concept of ADHD as a comorbid or coexisting disorder, or as Dodson argues here, as an inherent part of ADHD, particularly in adults? And my answer to that in this commentary is going to be no to both of those. RSD is not a valid disorder. RSD is not necessary to be added into ADHD in order to understand the strong emotional reactions that people with ADHD have to frustration, disappointment, failure, and other events in their life that can be very emotionally provocative. And finally, we don't need to include RSD within the symptom picture of adult ADHD because it doesn't add anything beyond what we already know. Now, to help you understand this point of view, let me just bring up a slideshow of mine on emotion regulation that I also gave for Attitude Magazine, and you can find this over at the Attitude website. Um, but in that presentation, I discussed the fact that an inherent part of ADHD is a problem with emotional self regulation. Why is that? Because ADHD is a disorder of executive functioning. And one of the executive functions, indeed a major one, is emotional self control. So ADHD already has a basis for explaining the high levels of emotional behavior that we see in people with ADHD. There's no reason to bring in yet another disorder to account for these uh, high rates of emotion.
Dr. William Dodson does think that it is a distinct condition and that the label is useful because it describes a kind of universal experience. And I have to say, I can see their points on both sides. Um, but we do want to cover it from a sort of science-based perspective. So we're going to play a short clip for you now from Dr. William Dodson talking, and he's going to explain kind of why it's so hard to describe rejection sensitivity.
In my own checklist, when I'm asking about rejection sensitive dysphoria, the question I have is for your entire life, in other words, going all the way back into childhood, have you always been much more sensitive than other people you know to rejection, teasing, criticism, or your own perception that you've failed or fallen short? This is directly from uh, a psychiatric textbook, an old one, and it's the definition of a technical term for psychiatrists called rejection sensitive dysphoria. It's important to note this is all a matter of degree. No one likes being rejected or criticized. Everybody hates it when we fail, we fall short, especially in front of other people. Rejection sensitive dysphoria is much more intense. And it's much more than this universal discomfort. When they were originally doing the research on this particular idea back 45 years ago, they wanted to get that intensity right up there in the name. And so they chose the word dysphoria, which unfortunately happens to be Greek, but it means unbearable, because that was the description they were getting people over and over and over again. Again, reasons unknown. People with rejection sensitivity have trouble describing what the intense emotion is all about. They can describe its intensity. It's awful, it's terrible, it's catastrophic, but not the quality of the mood. And so over and over again, these research subjects would finally just tell the researcher, look, man, back off. I can't find words to tell you what this awful feeling feels like, but I want you to know I can hardly stand it. And so that's where the word dysphoria came from. Is a researcher at Harvard who decided to put it into Greek, with that unbearable quality is very much part of what's going on, a part of the experience of rejection sensitive dysphoria.
So anyway, as Dr. Dodson says, it's a condition that's really hard to put into words and describe. And so what we wanted to do a little differently is, instead of jumping in and telling you what it feels like, we actually want to start with the science side, because I personally think it's a lot easier when you understand what's happening in the brain to then be able to connect that with the traits and understand what you're experiencing and what makes it different from anxiety, because I think that's one of the hardest things, is that it can, particularly to an outside observer, look like anxiety or even look like a condition like borderline or bipolar. And it's not, it's none of those things, it's its own thing. So we're going to start with the science on this episode.
Yeah, for people who don't experience, it can be hard to understand just how intense it can be. It's not just feeling bad; it's like it can be physically painful. So, Tara, I think you're going to break down some of why that feels so intense and physical at times.
Absolutely. And actually, to break it down, I'm going to do this a little out of order, and we're going to start with talking about what it's not. So then you can understand what it is. And so we're going to start by talking about a therapy that doesn't work, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. So, what is cognitive behavioral therapy? Well, it's in the name. Cognitive therapy examines the way you think, and then behavioral therapy examines your behaviors, and it tries to help you modify maladaptive behaviors. So, CBT, that's the acronym for it, is extremely effective. It is the gold standard for things like anxiety and depression, and even addressing cognitive distortions. So, cognitive distortions are black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking, like, I'm a failure and I will always be a failure. That's like a really extreme thought, right? With no room for nuance or gray area. So, that's an example of what a cognitive distortion is. So, CBT is really helpful for those things, but it's unfortunately not at all helpful for rejection sensitivity, and we're going to find out why that is. So let's talk about the way that CBT actually works. Imagine a field of grass. If you walk across that field one time, nothing is going to change about that field. Like if you go back tomorrow, it's going to look exactly the same. The grass is still going to be there. But imagine if you walk that exact same path over and over and over every single day. You're actually going to start to wear away at the grass and create like a little pathway for yourself. Well, your brain is actually kind of doing the same thing. If you follow the same route repeatedly, like the same neurons firing over and over, the pathway becomes more entrenched. And this is what happens with chronic anxiety. Those neurons are firing through the same route over and over. And so it becomes the fastest route. So you're upgrading it from a big open field like other people might have and where they might walk a bunch of different ways to a very well worn pathway that is the obvious path to take. And so that's what your brain is going to do. So, cognitive behavioral therapy tries to basically interfere with that and prevent you from going down the path that you carved. With CBT, it's like someone is putting up a yield sign and some caution tape and a bunch of other markers, and they left a little note asking if you've considered a different route. You don't have to use a different route, like it's not forcing you to use a different route. But when you can pause and slow down and examine your thoughts and behaviors calmly, impartially, without judgment in kind of a logical way, you regain more control over them and you can thoughtfully choose to take a different route sometimes. And so over time, as your brain goes down that different path, grass is going to start to grow back, and the route that you had originally carved in would start to disappear.
So Tara, are these changes just metaphorical or are they literally structural?
No, so that's the crazy part. It isn't a metaphor. I mean, it is, but it's not. It's literally structural. So, this is like the foundation of how neuroplasticity in the brain works. So, remember that neurons actually do literally look like a bunch of interconnected roads in real life. And so, if you change the sequence or route in which these neurons are firing, you're changing the physical shape of the brain. So, this is the cool part. They've done fMRI studies, which is like a brain scan, on people who have received cognitive behavioral therapy for social anxiety, looking at the amygdala. And we have the link to this study in the description as well. So, the amygdala, remember this one, this is an important little guy to remember. It's a little tiny almond shaped part of your limbic system of the brain. And if you want to think of it like in two words, it's your fear center. So when people talk about your lizard brain, they're literally referring to this limbic system that the amygdala is part of, because this region is basically the cognitive power that a lizard has. It's managing those sort of animalistic, instinctive, quick, primitive primal gut reactions to situations. So basically what you need to know about the amygdala is it's very loud and it's a little dramatic at times, and it manages our emotional responses to things and gives emotional context to memories, particularly fear-based ones. So to think about this in a practical situation. If you touch a hot stove, the amygdala is really, really important because it helps you to remember that moment and be afraid of burning yourself again. So, like the amygdala, we got to give it some props. It's keeping you alive. But you also don't want it firing too often and creating all these unnecessary fear based memories, like in the case of someone with chronic anxiety. And actually, the amygdala is relevant to ADHDers as well. They've found that there are developmental delays for us in the amygdala. So, malfunctioning amygdala is not just exclusive to anxiety, it's relevant to us too. But, anyways, what they have discovered with all these people who had social anxiety and who received cognitive behavioral therapy was that their amygdala was both volumetrically smaller and less sensitive after receiving therapy. So that makes
Whoa.
sense with what we know, right? If the patient is perceiving fewer threats and less anxiety with because of their cognitive behavioral therapy and they're using those pathways less often, then the pathways are less entrenched, right? So it will get physically smaller.
That's crazy. So it's actually changing in shape based on these like events.
Therapy is powerful, y'all. Like it's great. But it has to be the right therapy, right? So,
Yeah.
what's wrong with cognitive behavioral therapy? Why doesn't it work for rejection sensitivity? It's because it's has to do with the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that is constructing the metaphorical yield sign and caution tape around the pathway that you've created that's telling you to take an alternate route, right? Like cognitive behavioral therapy relies on the prefrontal cortex. So, if in a hypothetical scenario, totally hypothetical, if your prefrontal cortex was offline, then it would be pretty hard for cognitive behavioral therapy to actually work,
So
hypothetically.
in that case, yeah, like it wouldn't even be able to reach it, right?
Exactly. There's nobody there to tell you to slow down and consider a different route. There's no adult in the room.
So then what does the prefrontal cortex actually do?
Great question. It's a very important part of the brain, and unfortunately for us, it's one of the most profoundly impacted regions of the brain when you have ADHD. The prefrontal cortex is both developmentally delayed by a number of years. I think I've heard like 7 years on average with ADHDers. And it is in general smaller than with other people because we are using it a little less. So for all our ADHD listeners out there, just know that like things will get a little easier with time just because the prefrontal cortex continues to develop. Like for free. You don't even have to do anything. Things will get a little easier, which is great. But for these are overgeneralized. I've heard for people the prefrontal cortex develops by like 25 years old. It's one of the slowest developing. That's what's interesting. The primal parts of your brain develop more quickly than the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of responsible for humanity. It's responsible for higher level thought. It develops a lot more slowly. It takes more time. It's like an aged cheese, and ours takes a little
Yeah,
extra
it's
time to develop.
yeah. Yeah, it's crazy, but it like it also makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's relatable.
Oh yeah, it explains all our symptoms. And so I want you all to listen really closely to this list of things that I'm about to rattle off from my 7 pages of notes on this topic. Because I think it's critical not only to understanding just rejection sensitivity, but also to just fundamentally understanding ADHD itself. You hear a lot about the prefrontal cortex controlling executive function in ADHD videos, and that is absolutely one of the things it does. So that's like planning and working memory and time management. But it's also so much more than just that. So listen to this list. The prefrontal cortex, it handles higher order cognitive thinking and emotional processing. It's basically like the opposite of your little primal lizard brain limbic system because it's introspective and contemplative. So here's the list, right? Think about this in the context of your own life. It controls certain parts of speech and language. It controls risk processing. It helps us to align our actions with our internal goals and plans. It helps us to express our personality. It helps us to suppress urges and impulses. It processes pain signals and it determines the intensity with which you experience that pain. It helps us with self reflection and interpreting the thoughts of other people and like, what are they thinking and why are they thinking that? It helps us to reevaluate risk after we make that initial snap judgment of experiencing risk. And my personal favorite, because it's really fun to say, it handles metacognitive abilities. So this is thinking about thinking, remembering to remember.
So you basically just like broke down my weird speech patterns, like why I talk so strange, impulsivity, like my aversion or like sometimes aversion to risk, but also like willingness to seek out risks. The whole like time blindness thing I think is captured in there. The forgetfulness thing is captured in there. Yeah, that's I think that's
It's
a good
ADHD.
summary of it's a, yeah, it's a lot of ADHD symptoms. Yeah.
So, you can imagine these things are already impaired in us, right? But if your prefrontal cortex further shut down, like completely shut down, and turned off the lights, you might act in ways that don't seem congruent with your personality. It might be hard for you to speak. You might feel completely overwhelmed because you have trouble processing the words that other people are saying to you. You'd act impulsively and have trouble evaluating the risk of situations. You might make impulsive decisions that undermine your well being and goals. You would struggle with self awareness of your own thoughts and understanding the thoughts and motivations of other people. You might feel amplified physical pain, and you may even struggle to remember portions of the event that triggered it. What does that sound like?
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like RSD.
Yep, that sounds like RSD. And just, to put the cherry on top, because that's not all, the crazy thing is that the prefrontal cortex doesn't just impact itself when it shuts down, it impacts the rest of your brain. And this is because the prefrontal cortex acts like a control center. Like the prefrontal cortex controls all the other parts. It can amplify or increase the signals from some parts of your brain, and conversely, it can dampen or decrease those signals as well as appropriate. So remember how we said the prefrontal cortex is responsible for like the hypothetical yield signs and caution tape during cognitive behavioral therapy? This is literally what I mean. The prefrontal cortex can dampen signal from the amygdala, your little primal lizard brain, when it feels like the amygdala is being a little extra and being a little too much. So, if the prefrontal cortex turns off, your anxious little almond lobe amygdala can go nuts and freak out and scream and shout about impending doom and store and retain all these spooky memories about horrible, scary things. And nobody's around to tell it to shut up. There's no adult in the room to like tell it to calm down and stop storing these incredibly painful memories. So, you kind of get hit with a double whammy when the prefrontal cortex shuts down. And this is rejection sensitivity, presumably. I'll be honest, this paper that I'm pulling from is actually not even about RSD. It's about the mechanism of action of guanfacine. We're going to talk about this later. It's the medication that you would generally use to treat RSD. And so, I'll caveat all of this with hypothetically, we think this is what's happening. But because we kind of understand what guanfacine is doing, and guanfacine treats rejection sensitivity, and it also fits like a glove. We're making some leaps here, do with this information what you will, but it doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to assume that maybe this is how RSD works. So, getting into the paper a little bit, I do want to read you a little blurb before we jump in deeper.
But before we jump into that paper, I went to Threads recently to ask the community what RSD feels like, and I got a couple of really interesting responses.
Yeah, I was checking out some of your responses. You all delivered. They are great.
Yeah, so one person said, I struggled with this for years and years, and it ruined my life because everything that happened to me was between my ears, and rarely anything I thought about was happening in real life. Another person said, RSD feels like being hit with a wave of intense emotion over something small, like a comment or a missed opportunity. and it's hard to explain unless you felt it, like a sharp, sudden punch to your self-worth. What helps me is grounding myself when those feelings hit. Deep breaths, some somatic exercise or tapping doesn't make it go away, but it helps to ease the intensity and bring you back to the present moment. Another one says, every single day, and it gets worse with age, as I could manage it in my 20s and 40s before I knew what it was, then in my 50s, I've had to self-isolate to avoid the conflict associated with it. I retired early from a profession I love because I couldn't tolerate the criticism in my field. And I'm fine as long as I'm alone, which is isolating, but the only thing that has worked for me. I hope you find a treatment or therapy that works for you. I wouldn't wish this on anyone.
Well, and I think that that is such a profound point, right? Like RSD is such a powerful response that it modifies like your personality, right? Like it can make you be avoidant or lash out in ways that are, like we said, incongruent with your own actual personality and dearly held beliefs, because that's all the prefrontal cortex handling your personality. And so when it shuts down, it both impacts the way you react in the moment, and also it impacts the ways you react not in the moment, because you're trying to avoid having such a catastrophic, horrendous feeling occurring to you.
Absolutely. And it's clear from a lot of these responses that it's real, it's visceral, and it's something people can relate to because they experience it so intensely.
Well, and that's, we kind of joked in our New Year's prediction episode about how I'm disappointed in the DSM, but like this is why. This is why I have so many problems with the DSM, because this is not mentioned once. And as you can see from these responses, this is a devastating symptom for so many people with ADHD. Like I think in Dodson's talk, he says that it's like the most debilitating symptom according to 30% of ADHDers. The number one, not the time management, not the other stuff. You can figure out ways around it. But the rejection sensitivity, it just feels like there is no hope and no way, which by the way, we are going to talk about things you can do. So I don't want you all to think that there's no hope. But for our non-listeners and for people who don't have doctors who understand it, my God, it can feel like it's ruining your life.
As evident by I think a lot of people sharing very similar sentiments.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's amazing for something that's so hard to describe. It's amazing the consistency of the responses and how they
Yeah.
all are about the same. Yeah. So to jump back into the paper, because I want you all to really, really understand it before we talk about treatments, because I think that's critical to getting treatment. I want to share a little quote from the paper first. It is noteworthy that many of the discoveries made in this field were by women neuroscientists. As this recognition may provide inspiration to young women and girls wanting to become scientists, many of their names will be emphasized in this review. And so I just wanted to mention that quickly to honor the wishes of the authors of this paper as well. That I don't pull in names because I didn't want to make this like even more complex, but definitely worth checking out the paper and reading the names of these amazing women who really helped us to learn all this stuff more deeply. Even way back in the 80s when it was like pretty hard for women to get into science. The prefrontal cortex research is like way back then. So anyway, to summarize what their findings are. Basically, the brain is able to dynamically and rapidly modify its own plasticity. So, in other words, if you picture like a big old multi lane highway, like let's say you have 5 lanes in your brain, it basically has the ability to shut down a couple of those lanes on the fly to prevent so many cars from passing through. It might even close a road altogether and tell all of those cars that they need to just go around and like take a detour. So this is what happens when the brain reduces plasticity to decrease neuronal firing. Even though you structurally have a 5-lane highway, we are functionally behaving like a 2-lane highway. We're going from 100 cars per minute on the road and dropping down to 50. So this process that they discovered is called dynamic network connectivity. And it's actually a pretty new area of research for neuroscience, but it is like rapidly transforming our understanding of conditions like schizophrenia and Alzheimer's. So this isn't something exclusive to us either. Under normal conditions, norepinephrine binds to the alpha 2A adrenoceptors in the prefrontal cortex to inhibit the cyclic AMP pathway from releasing potassium ions. So I know that sounds like
Okay,
a
okay.
lot.
That was a lot. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah, and that was even a little bit of a simplification, from what's actually in the paper. So, I will disclaimer if you guys click on the paper, she's dense, but, this is what you need to understand. So let's break it down. So alpha 2A adrenoceptors are just receptors in the prefrontal cortex, and they're sitting there waiting for norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter, to bind to them. So think of this like a lock. The receptors are the lock, and the norepinephrine is the key that perfectly fits into that lock. So when you put the key into the lock, we're closing a very important door that we really, really want to keep shut. But sometimes, in periods of overwhelming stress, the norepinephrine key gets diverted to a different lock, which is the alpha 1A lock instead of the alpha 2A lock. So, when there's no keys in the alpha 2A lock, then the door is wide open, and this door is called cyclic AMP. So, don't let that name scare you. Basically, a bunch of
I'm already
potassium.
scared.
It's a lot. I get it, but, um, you know, if you need to, you can pause it, you can replay it. Not you, you're recording this live, but our listeners can pause it and replay it if they really, really wanna understand. But basically, a bunch of potassium ions go running through that door whenever it's opened and wreak havoc. The potassium ions start yelling at your prefrontal cortex and they're telling it to shut down. And unfortunately, it's going to listen to them immediately. It cannot be overstated how instantaneous this response is. I mean, this is kind of what defines this process is that you get these instantaneous responses. And after that, the prefrontal cortex will remain shut down until the potassium ions stop screaming and go away. So this shutdown can last a really long time. So this is why during an RSD episode, it can really feel like you have no other option than to ride it out once you've been triggered. Because that's actually what's happening. Your prefrontal cortex has to stay shut down until the potassium ions go away and allow it to turn on again. And I don't mean to
Yeah.
unfairly malign potassium. Don't don't take this as a suggestion to like not consume potassium or something. Potassium is a very important ion in your body. It serves a lot of very critical purposes that keep you alive. It's just these particular, potassium ions are kind of being mean to us, but you can't judge a whole group by a couple of bad seeds.
Well, that's really relatable, actually. I think it explains, like, when I've experienced that, sometimes it is like going from 0 to 100 or 0 to shut down, like, it ramps up fast, and then it sticks with me. Like, there's been times where, like, I've been going through an RSD episode, and I feel like it feels so heavy for such a long amount of time. That's your point about, like, writing it out. I think sometimes that's all you really can do, and then, like, I feel bad for the people around me because if they don't know what's happening, I cannot, in that moment, emotionally regulate enough to explain it or describe it.
I had really unhealthy coping mechanisms in, like, high school and college. I mean, high school, it was triggering all the freaking time for me because high school.
Mhm, mhm.
And what I would do is just stay up so late until I was too tired to feel anything anymore, which, probably helped to establish my very unhealthy sleeping patterns today. But it was like that's all you could do. I would just sit and, like, play video games, like, play Mario Kart over and over, and try and distract myself until I was just too numb to, like, feel this anymore, and then I could go to bed.
Yeah, I feel like that for me, I wish it was video games. I think that, I definitely struggle with substances a little bit, when I was younger, especially in my college years and in my 20s, and I think that is it's 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 not surprising, and I think common why people with undiagnosed ADHD can go through this and then turn to substances like
Totally.
alcohol.
I mean, this is
Yeah.
such a painful and again, like, physically painful, right? Like we said, prefrontal cortex, it plays a certain role in experiencing pain. And it's like if you're having this, like, overwhelming, all-consuming like, I used to describe it as, like, everything would flash white, um, and, like, your my throat hurts and stuff. Like my throat is tightening up a little bit just talking about it. And so of course you're going to turn to substances. You're going to do whatever you can do to shut this thing off because it's horrendous. So like,
And you just want it to stop.
yeah, so of course that's how you're going to respond. Well,
Yeah.
and again, like we established earlier, it doesn't just impact the prefrontal cortex. When the norepinephrine key is in the alpha 2A lock, it also dynamically weakens signaling from the amygdala. So you can think of that as like when the door is closed, it's nice and soundproof and it's muffling all that shouting from the amygdala on the outside. But when our norepinephrine key goes missing and the door is opened, you can hear the amygdala shouting and screaming at a deafening volume, and there's no prefrontal cortex around to even help soothe you when you're hearing these scary things. So it's like double whammy. So of course you're going to do whatever you can do to get it to shut down or to get not to get it to shut down. You're going to do whatever you can do to get it to go away.
For better or worse. Yeah.
For better or for worse. So, okay, now that we've learned about the process, I do want to play a short clip for you from the Yale School of Medicine where they describe this phenomenon in their own words. I know that it is chock full of neuroscience jargon. I get it. It'll probably sound a little intimidating if this isn't like a special interest. But the truth is, I don't have a neuroscience degree. And so everything that I know is just self taught. And so I really think it's important for you to hear it from experts in addition to just hearing it from me so that you're hearing it from reputable sources.
Close-up view of the synapses where the neurons communicate shows that these pyramidal cells excite each other through glutamate NMDA receptor synapses, which are on dendritic spines. These spines also express potassium channels that can be opened by high levels of calcium cyclic AMP signaling. When potassium channels are opened by high levels of calcium cyclic AMP signaling, they rapidly reduce the strength of the synaptic connections, which reduces neuronal firing. The arousal systems, such as norepinephrine and dopamine, take advantage of this mechanism to coordinate our cognitive state with our state of arousal. As you may have experienced yourself, arousal has an inverted U influence on prefrontal connectivity and function, where either too little arousal when we're fatigued or too much arousal when we're stressed weakens our prefrontal abilities. At the extremes of this inverted U, we are unconscious, for example, in deep sleep, and possibly with traumatic stress. This may be related to the absence of prefrontal synaptic connections under these conditions. Under optimal levels of arousal, prefrontal cortex provides top-down regulation of thought, action, and emotion, and we are capable of mindful responses. However, with uncontrollable stress, high levels of catecholamine release impair dorsolateral prefrontal function and strengthen more primitive circuits, switching the brain from a reflective to a more reflexive state where we are governed by unconscious habitual emotions and actions.
One of the things she mentioned at the end of this video is really fascinating for me, which is this inverted U shape for the prefrontal cortex activity, where she was saying that there's sort of a optimal level of functioning and you don't want to be too far on either end. And I feel like just that alone helps to describe the ADHD experience, in my opinion, because we spend so much time existing at the two extreme ends. So it's like our prefrontal cortex either shuts down because we're painfully bored and it physically hurts and we need stimulation, or it shuts down because we're
Yeah.
overwhelmed with these intense negative emotions. And so we just don't get as much time as other people existing in that nice middle part of the inverted U that everybody else gets to experience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, another thing I want to point out, this intense emotional shutdown is a totally normal process for every human being. Like she says in the video, like this isn't exclusive to ADHD. And it gets triggered for everyone else in moments of high stress too. Like think about someone who's been in like a car accident. Their mental state would shift immediately after the accident happens and it would remain altered for hours after that. So then imagine if you went up to them right after a car accident and you were asking them like what they want for dinner. They wouldn't be able to make a
Huh.
decision like that in the moment. Or if you ask them what color shirt their spouse was wearing this morning, they're going to be way too overwhelmed to remember those sorts of details. And they might even like lash out and snap at you uncharacteristically and get mad about your stupid, pointless questions, even if they aren't normally an angry, snippy person. And you'd understand, right? Like you're like, well, you've just been in a car accident. Like I get it. You're being a jerk, but like I get it. It's justified. So you can see their prefrontal cortex has also undergone that same shutdown, same process.
So if that's happening with us with ADHD, it's like going through an RSD episode could be like going through a car accident, except no one can see it. So we can
Exactly.
respond the same way,
Exactly.
and it's harder to explain.
The brain is designed to shut down in moments of extreme stress for a reason. I haven't read why. I don't know. This is just me hypothesizing, but my guess would maybe be that you don't spend time thinking about thinking and that you spend time reacting, right? Like if you think of like a from a primal level, why would that be useful to have your entire prefrontal cortex shut down? My guess would be
Yeah.
that the amygdala wants to take the driver's seat if you're being like hunted by a jaguar or if you're in a car wreck or obviously prehistoric humans like didn't have cars, but like if you're being hunted by a jaguar, you want that lizard brain to take control and like take the wheel. You don't want to sit there pondering about life or thinking about why is that jaguar so mean. But
Yeah.
so this is a normal process. It happens for everyone, but for whatever reason, the shutdown seems to happen a lot more for ADHDers. And again, I'm not sure of the exact reason behind this. I don't know that anyone knows right now. Maybe it's due to the fact that people with ADHD just have lower norepinephrine to begin with, and so we just have fewer keys to go around. I mean, it could be the structural differences in the prefrontal cortex or something about the amygdala triggers it more, or there's some other contributing factor that convinces your brain that it's like a really good idea to just shut down your prefrontal cortex all the time, like really smart. But regardless, hopefully this explanation helps you to understand that rejection sensitivity is fundamentally different from anxiety and helps explain why it feels the way it does, and explains the sensations in a little bit different way since it is so hard to like articulate. There are real biological mechanisms behind all these sensations with all the feelings associated with rejection sensitivity.
So when I was asking threads about for people to share their RSD experiences, some people shared some things that have helped them, and one person shared it doesn't cure it, but brain dump journaling. RSD to me feels like a spiral of hurt and magnifying of situations or perceptions. It needs an outlet, or I just keep intensifying until it forces an outlet, which can get ugly. So I have to give it one. Putting things on paper helps me give the spiral somewhere to go, and it helps me sort out my thoughts and actually see the situation more clearly. It's like a depressurizer and clarifier all in one. I think it's a really helpful tip.
Yeah, it's interesting. It almost feels like it's externalizing the role of the prefrontal cortex. And you know how we get tips all the time as ADHDers, like make a list, take notes, which is externalizing the role of the prefrontal cortex in working memory. This feels like it's externalizing the role of the prefrontal cortex in emotional processing, almost like write it down. And then when you're thinking to yourself, like, oh my God, I'm going to get fired. When you can see your own words written down, no, you're not. Like it's sort of a brute force external prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, yeah. And another person on Threads was mentioning how they actually will channel it into a creative outlet. So they'll use this, right, poetry and songs, which I thought was really interesting. But back to therapy, there is a more specialized version of CBT called dialectic behavioral therapy, and that can help. Dialectic behavioral therapy was originally developed by a renowned psychologist, Marsha Linehan. Am I saying that right? Marsha Linehan?
I don't know if it's
Marsha
Linehan or
Linehan?
Linehan. Marcia, we are so sorry.
Marsh
We love you
Marsha
and respect
Linehan?
you.
In the late 1980s to help borderline personality disorder. Marsha herself had borderline, which is a personality disorder characterized by low self-esteem, a crippling fear of abandonment, and large, volatile emotional reactions that create instability in all of your relationships. That sounds familiar. I want to call out that there's a massive oversimplification of a complex disorder, but it's enough to help you understand why a treatment first developed by borderline would also help with ADHD. That makes perfect sense, and I think it makes it really relatable.
Mhm.
And since its inception, DBT has been to be highly effective for other conditions like bipolar or self-harm. So DBT it's good for any condition characterized by large emotional reactions where you don't feel in control.
That
And
sounds a
unlike
lot like
ordinary
RSD.
yeah, it sounds a lot like RSD. And unlike ordinary CBT, the goal of DBT isn't necessarily to change your thinking patterns or to examine them in a logical way. It focuses instead on helping you identify triggers and manage big feelings more effectively. We could think about it kind of like physical pain. So if you have an injury, CBT can help you to heal the wound. But unfortunately, rejection sensitivity is not necessarily something you can heal. You've got to kind of write it out. So DBT is helping to raise your pain tolerance, which I think makes a lot of sense.
I
Um,
like that. I mean, of course, it'd be great to heal the wound, but raising your pain tolerance is like the second best option.
yeah, especially if it's something that you're going to encounter or you know you're going to encounter and you know that it's not going to heal itself. You've
Yeah.
got to have a way to cope.
We're turning ourselves into like little resiliency wizards, basically.
I like that. So DBT has four main skills: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness to help you manage big emotions. DBT therapy is going to take longer than CBT, but the great thing is that it's still time boxed, just like CBT, so you won't be in therapy indefinitely for years, and eventually you'll get to graduate, you'll gain the skills, and you can move on.
Yeah, I like that because I feel like some people are very scared of therapy. A, because they think it'll just go on and on forever, and B, because of the cost, right? And so if you know that like this is a fixed amount of time, and even if it does take up to a year, it's only a year, and then your life is going to be better. Like that is just so much more manageable to sign up for.
Yeah, and those skills I think are really beneficial in lots of areas of your life. Mindfulness, I think, is one of the
Mhm.
most powerful things people with ADHD can learn because it teaches you how to sit with those emotions. It can help with everything we're talking about, including emotional dysregulation, right? That tolerance, um, all of it can really be a powerful skill set in managing day to day life.
Totally. And what I've heard about DBT, it depends on your finances and your situation and stuff. DBT is best done with a therapist because they can help. It's just more effective when you're connected to the person that you're practicing it with, and that gets a little bit into like psychodynamic therapy as well. But if you're completely broke and you are like cash strapped and you just like cannot afford DBT right now, no matter what. Which again, I would say if you think you can, I think it's worth it to splurge a little because this is like for your mental well being. But again, if you absolutely cannot, there are books that can help teach you DBT. And there are books for DBT that are made for neurodivergent people where they've slightly adapted some of the approaches specifically for us, for our brains, which, has to make you feel a little special, right? And you're going to get a little watered down, truncated version, but it's still better than nothing. And those books, they sell them on Amazon. And so DBT should, in theory, be pretty accessible for everyone in some form or another.
And it's in therapy works, and it's hard to put a price on healing,
Yeah.
and it's hard to put a price on building the skills that will help you.
Yeah, I would say if you think you can swing it, go with someone, particularly someone who is specialized in DBT, because not every therapist is the same. They have to go through very specialized training for DBT treatment. So, if you're going to shell out the money, I would go with someone who has that specialty, and even go with like a telehealth option if you don't have any like local therapists in your area. But everybody's finances are unique. Strongly consider the actual therapist route. We think it's worth it, but
Yeah, and it's good to know what to ask for and the kind of therapy that actually can help.
yeah,
Even without knowing that, you could get stuck in a situation where you're paying for therapy that might not be the best fit.
Well, and that's the problem, right? Is that this looks like a CBT situation to a lot of outside therapists who don't have that sort of depth of experience with ADHDers. And so you could pay for CBT or you could pay for talk therapy for years and years and years, and it's not going to help the RSD. It's not going to help. It could help other parts. A lot of ADHDers are just anxious people. I will warn, CBT also appears to be not good and potentially harmful to autistic people. And I can we'll link a video that explains that coming from a therapist. Um, so tread lightly with CBT in particular. Um, but if you receive the wrong treatment modality, it's just not going to work. Like, it's kind of like if you have lower back pain, and you go into physical therapy and they are having you do stretches on your neck or something, or like strengthening your arms. That's great. That's a good thing to do. It's always good to have strong arms. But it's still not going to help your lower back pain. And so you want to find the correct treatment modality for the thing that's affecting you. So, we've been talking about therapy, but therapy is not your only option to deal with this as well. Medication is another tool in your arsenal. And again, I want to briefly touch on one that doesn't work before we talk about what does. And so that would be SSRIs. A lot of doctors hear these symptoms and they chalk it up to social anxiety, and they'll prescribe you an SSRI, which is a standard type of anxiety medication. And a lot of ADHDers will try out a bunch of varieties of SSRIs with minimal effect or maybe even moderate success if they also have comorbid anxiety, but it just is not going to help with the RSD. So, why don't SSRIs help with RSD? Well, it's in the name. A selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI, is designed to increase serotonin. And if you didn't notice, I have not mentioned serotonin once during this whole long spiel. So I don't know, the exact science of rejection sensitivity is completely settled, because actually the paper that I've been referencing this whole time is not a paper on RSD. It's a paper on the medication I am about to talk about and its mechanism of action. But presumably, if this med works and this is how the med works, then it's a reasonable assumption that this might be the underlying cause of RSD as well. But I think as far as we know right now, it just really does not seem like serotonin is involved at all. So, also stimulants you might think would help, because they help with many other aspects of ADHD, but they generally don't reduce RSD. And this is likely because they're acting primarily in the corpus striatum to increase inhibition. So, it's just a completely different purpose and a completely different part of the brain.
And it's interesting because as I've been thinking about like some of what it feels like, you would think some of these things would work because some ways it's been described, but even just like feeling it myself, it can feel like depression, right? It can feel like acute depression or like extreme like sadness. And so you would think that it might have to do with serotonin, or even like why you would think that SSRI or something would work. So it's fascinating that those are not
I would take it
effective.
a step further. In some of the videos from Dr. Dodson, he's kind of the guy that like really popularized the term RSD. That's why we've been referencing him so much. He actually describes it as like a sudden onset personality disorder, like because the
Wow.
the symptoms are
Yeah.
so extreme and so rapid. But that's the difference, right? It's not a global um, condition. It's not happening to you all the time. It is sudden onset caused by a very predictable trigger every single time. It's with personality disorders, it's not quite as like, oh, this thing happened which caused this. It's more all the time. And so similarly, Strattera, which is one of the most common non-stimulant options, has also had really disappointing results in a lot of the studies that they've done, the more recent studies looking at emotional dysregulation improvements. But that doesn't mean we don't have medication options. So enter alpha-2 adrenoceptor agonists.
Right now, as we sit here today, medications are the only thing we have to offer that have a proven track record, because they're there all the time. We have two basic groups. We have the stimulant class medications, which are amphetamine, methylphenidate, etc., which help directly with inhibition. They help slow things down. They help inhibit both input that would distract us and output. It gives you the same 2 seconds that everybody else has to see an emotion or an action coming up, to play it out in your mind. If this happens, then this will happen, then that'll happen. Oh, I don't want that to happen. I'll redirect it. The alpha agonists, of which we have two, guanfacine and clonidine, inhibit the energy, driving the speed and intensity of response. Interesting enough, when we look at just plain effectiveness, when we measure how effective is this treatment, the alpha agonists are significantly more effective than are the stimulants. Usually that's kind of a false choice because most people end up taking both classes of medication.
So it was actually a blood pressure medication originally, but they realized that it's not very good at that, and it's much better for treating ADHD, especially rejection sensitivity. So you might recognize names of the two major players in this med category if you've ever kind of talked to a doctor about this. So these are clonidine, which is also called Capvey, and guanfacine, which is also known as Intuniv. So how do these help treat rejection sensitivity? Um, and like I said, that is what this entire paper that I've been referencing is basically just how does guanfacine work? What is it doing in your brain? And basically, they act like synthetic keys. So the door stays locked all the time, and the prefrontal cortex doesn't get shut down. And a really cool thing about these medications is that your prefrontal cortex stays online for longer because it isn't being constantly shut down from RSD episodes. And so, after a little while, like a couple months to years of medication usage, your brain starts to notice that these pathways are being used all the time, and it will eventually lead to lasting structural changes. So basically, it sees that you have a popular 5-lane highway in your prefrontal cortex, and it will construct a few more lanes to add to that route because your brain is the ultimate city planner, which makes that pathway stronger and more efficient. And in other words, it's kind of healing the prefrontal cortex. It will get better at all the jobs that are assigned to the prefrontal cortex.
That's super fascinating, and like I'm glad you broke it down that way because I was wondering about that. That's something that came up a lot on Threads even, and as I've been talking to people about it and asking about it, people have been mentioning guanfacine, and so it's fascinating to know that there is a medication out there that actually changes those
Yeah,
structures.
absolutely. And that it has lasting effects too. It's not like, if you take it for a couple of years, it's not like if you come off, then everything will come right back. It takes a couple of years, but it really does help to heal some of those parts. So I personally take guanfacine and I've been on it consistently for a few years. In my experience, it has
Wow.
really helped to raise the threshold of an RSD episode. So what I mean is that it takes a lot more to trigger it these days. It has to be like a pretty clear cut rejection. Otherwise, I mostly just
Okay.
feel a momentary twinge of pain, and then I'm able to let it go more quickly and just like move on.
So it's not like it's actually eliminating RSD or solving it, but it's raising that threshold enough that it's like the little things that used to maybe send you into pure devastation aren't happening as often.
Exactly. Yeah. And then so it's like it takes a lot more for it to happen. And then when it does happen, I'm able to talk myself back down a lot more easily with logic, or at least have the self-awareness to know that it'll pass. And then the other interesting thing is that the traumatic memories that you form during an RSD episode don't seem to stick around as often either. Like I still have memories from before the medication where I felt rejected, and when I think about those, it like hurts just as much as the day it originally happened, and it like physically hurts like when I'm just recalling the memory and I want to curl up and hide. But I really can't remember
Feeling
any
that feeling.
memories from probably the last couple of years that are so like profoundly painful and intense. So I think the memories themselves are not sticking in quite the same way either, which would, indicate
Yeah,
the
that's really
amygdala is being shut up, right?
yeah, that's really powerful.
Absolutely. Well, and there's also fun bonuses too. So my short-term memory has become amazing. Like I can't even believe it. It's night and day. Like I'm so much better at like word recall, which is actually really nice because sometimes when I'm talking with other ADHD friends and they're like forgetting words, I'm kind of able to help people out more often. And that's one of the things I've noticed is I don't get stuck on a word as often. And I found that the proportion of time when I'm helping other people remember the word that they can't think of has just like shot up. Like I'm like, wow, this is crazy. I'm really good at memory games now, like where you're like matching
Huh.
cards and stuff. You know, and that's working memory, right? Like working memory for ADHDers is impaired in the sense that neurotypicals can generally hold about 7 things in their mind at once. And I think I've read ADHDers can usually only hold like 5 things in working memory.
Yeah, working memory thing, it's a huge challenge. And so it's cool to hear that this impacts working memory too. I mean, this sounds
Yeah.
awesome. Um, but like I'm wondering like why we don't know more about this. Like why is this the first time I feel like I'm hearing about this? Like, either on like just asking about it on threads, or even like and even in that it was a few people that were bringing it up, but people were talking about it. But why don't we know more
Do you mean
about it?
from a research standpoint, or why don't doctors know more about it?
Yeah, like why, like my psychiatrist hasn't talked about this at all. Like where did you hear about
Yeah,
it?
my doctor, but it wasn't the first doctor I talked to. I mean, gosh, he's probably like the fourth or fifth, but he's the guy that I go to now. He's kind of like a regional expert in Washington State. um, so
Wow.
yeah, I don't know. The answer is I don't know. I don't know why. uh, I think there's a lot of misinformation among doctors about medications. Like one of the things I've noticed is um, a lot of psychiatrists don't know the difference between amphetamine and methylphenidate. I've had friends go in and their doctors start them on Vyvanse, and I've told them to ask why Vyvanse and why not, Concerta. And their response that they got was,
Yeah.
"Well, Vyvanse is just the one that I know best, and so we can experiment with it best." And it's like that's not how that
Wow.
works.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that came
So
off as really harsh, but I mean, yeah, I think just a lot of doctors don't necessarily. I shouldn't say a lot. I think some doctors don't look into the differences between these different medication classes and um, y- don't recognize like and maybe it could be like Strattera and Wellbutrin. Those you don't want to take with a stimulant. Those would be either or, and maybe they're just assuming that guanfacine is a similar thing where you wouldn't want to take it with a stimulant. But actually, I've seen a couple papers that say that you have fewer side effects when you take them together versus individually. So,
wow. So it could just come down to the general
yeah.
awareness. How well does that? Do you have a sense of how well this works for like other people? Like it's working really well for you. What's the population that this is in like helpful
Yeah,
for?
well, and one quick thing I do want to point out too, it isn't just helpful for ADHDers. They're starting to look into it for things like PTSD, OCD. So another thing I should mention is in our OCD episode, I talked about how I don't think that I necessarily qualify as OCD, and part of that too is because I don't have kind of the recurrence the same way that a lot of OCDers have because OCD is for most people somewhat of a lifelong condition. Um, but
Yeah.
there's also a possibility that if I was sort of cuspy for OCD, like kind of right on the line, um, that this could have helped with that. Because I really can't think of anything that would even come close to qualifying as OCD in recent years. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. But this is also a potentially helpful medication for OCD. In terms of the
That's
ADHD
really cool.
population, unfortunately, guanfacine and clonidine don't work for everybody. It seems like guanfacine helps roughly 30% of ADHDers, and clonidine also helps around 30%, which sucks. But the good news is that the people who are helped by guanfacine don't seem to overlap with the clonidine people, which means about 60% of folks overall probably benefit from these medication classes. And like we mentioned
Wow. Okay.
earlier, they're completely safe to take alongside stimulants. And in fact, they can cancel each other out in certain ways. So, for example, stimulants tend to raise your blood pressure a little bit. And like we said, these are formerly blood pressure meds, these will help lower it. Stimulants can also make it hard to fall asleep, and these drugs will actually make you a little bit sleepy, especially in the beginning when you first start taking them, which is why you should generally take them like before bed every day. And then they can also they just kind of they cancel each other out. It's like peanut butter and jelly. They're very synergistic in a lot of ways for helping to manage your ADHD, because this medication is helping to decrease emotional reactivity, and then the stimulants help with impulsivity, and so together you just don't have these blow up episodes when they're working together. So if rejection sensitivity or even emotional dysregulation overall is something that you're struggling with, I think this is really worth exploring as an option with your doctor.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting to know that there are other medications and other options available that definitely are worth discussing with your psychiatrist or your doctor, just to see like, yeah, if this makes sense. You said something there a minute ago that I think is really an interesting metaphor, something you've said before, which is limiting the blast radius. I like that term in terms of like limiting how much damage is done by an RSD
Totally,
episode.
because I mean, we can react in very unpredictable and out of character ways, and ways that don't necessarily benefit us. For example, think about if you're having an RSD episode and because your manager gave you negative feedback or something, right? You might just be like, "Well, I'm going to quit," and then tomorrow you might
Yeah,
realize you shouldn't have quit your job. And so one
yeah,
of the things that I like to do is when I do recognize that I'm in an RSD episode is to remove myself entirely. So what I mean is like I said, if it happens at work, I'll just be like, you know what? I'm having RSD. I know it will continue for the rest of the day. I'm gonna log off. And or like if you have RSD with a friend or a loved one or something, don't text them for 24 hours. Like give yourself enough time to kind of come down off of that like RSD high so that you can make decisions that are a little bit more thought out like before you do anything brash. So yeah, I like to call that limiting the blast radius. Like something bad has already happened. You're gonna have to write it out. Don't do more damage for yourself by acting on impulse after that.
yeah. That's really good advice. And another thing I think that plays nicely into that too is something you and I have talked about with each other a little bit, which is like the importance of RSD buddies. And I like this, just like knowing there's somebody else who understands that feeling and knows what you're going through. Having a friend that's like a safe person to text, right? Having an outlet for that can really help. And knowing you're not alone, or that it's not just you, or that it's something happening physiologically that you can write it out with. And so I remember when we were taking our coaching class together, you would text me about like just certain comments other students were making, and how that either made you feel or made me feel. And it was helpful having this like another person
Yeah. That
in the
one
room
that
to
one
kind of
really got
like,
to me. That was probably one of my more recent RSD memories, and luckily it wasn't like too severe, so it's not that bad to talk about.
and I mean, and that's what RSD will do to you. And it's been helpful for me too, where like I've had episodes, and just like whether or not I've like texted you, just knowing that you're on the
Mhm.
other end is helpful, right? I feel like I'm in it with somebody else, or it's like there's that, it takes away some of that loneliness, or just like even just having another person
Yeah, name
there.
it to tame it. It's huge.
Yeah, name it, tame it. Love that phrase. So if you take one thing away from this episode, it's this: RSD is real. You're not alone in it. And while you can't completely get rid of it, there's a lot of things you can do to learn to manage it, whether it's like DBT, mindfulness, lean on the RSD by looking at some of the other medication options like guanfacine. So if this episode resonated with you, share it with somebody who might need it. And if you have your own experiences, we'd love to hear how you manage RSD, and what kind of things are working for
Yeah,
you.
tune in next week for more nerdy science stuff.